let's talk about phloem. So xylem is the vascular tissue that moves water and nutrients up a tree. Phloem is the vascular tissue that moves sugars and dissolved nutrients and hormones and secondary compounds, moves them all throughout the plant. Okay? Vascular tissue that moves dissolved sugars, nutrients, and secondary compounds throughout the plant. So a couple things about this. It can move in either direction, right? So phloem sap is what we call it. Can move both up and down a plant. But generally, we say that it flows from what's called a sugar source to a sugar sink. Which basically means that it's going to flow from an area where there's a lot of sugar or where a lot of sugar is being produced to an area that doesn't have a lot of sugar or that is storing sugar, storing large quantities of sugar. Okay, and the direction of the flow often changes based on the season. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so let's say that we've got summer here. This is going to represent summer. Okay, in the summer, the sun is nice and bright, and it provides a lot of energy for plants to grow. So let's say we got a nice potato plant here, and it's growing and it's absorbing the sunlight and it's going through photosynthesis and it's producing a whole bunch of sugars, right? That means that the leaves are going through photosynthesis and they are becoming what's called the sugar source. And then they are producing excess sugars, more sugars than they need, and they can take those sugars that are excess and they can store them down in their sugar bank here, which in the case of potatoes are tubers that are full of starch, right? So these become the sugar sink. So in this case, what happens is the sugar flows, the phloem sap flows from the source to the sink, right? So essentially what they're doing is they're putting sugar away for later. And the way that they do that is that potatoes are made out of starch. Starch is non-water soluble, and so they're making this non-water soluble polysaccharide that can easily be broken down to use later if they need to use it. Okay? So then it's wintertime. And in the wintertime, let's say that it is snowing. These are little snowflakes. So what happens to the plant in the wintertime? What would happen to potato plants in the winter? Whoops. Anybody know?
Would the plant use that? Like use them for
Not in the wintertime. In the wintertime, they die, right? So they basically, their leaves will shrivel up, right? And they'll die. Whoops. I mean, like something like that, right? And they shrivel up so that it's just like these little nubs of the leaves that you got down here, okay? But underneath the ground, there's still potatoes, okay? So you got these potatoes down here that have stored up all the sugar from the summer months, and they are just lying there dormant for a while, okay? And then that means that in the springtime, when the sun comes back out, there's a little problem. So now the sun's out, but all you have, why do I keep doing that? All you have are these little nubs. Okay? So are these little nubs, do they have enough surface area to go through photosynthesis? No. So what happens is that the potatoes that are underneath the ground become the sugar source, and it starts sending sugar up to the leaves. Okay? Those leaves can then use that sugar, that energy, and that actual raw material of sugar to grow. Okay? And it gives them a jump start, allows them to grow their leaves again. And then that means that the next year, right, it's going to go through the summertime, and those leaves are going to have even more sugar stored up, so that the next winter comes along and you've got even larger potatoes, and then those larger potatoes can be used to make larger leaves, and then those larger leaves can make even more potatoes, and then those can be used to make larger leaves and larger potatoes and larger leaves and larger potatoes, and you get the idea, right? This is why plants that die off every year in the wintertime are able to still come back and be the same size, if not larger than they were the next year, right? Because they're storing those sugars down in root tubers in this case. Bulbs is another way that these things would be stored. Bulbs are essentially just large quantities of starches that are stored in the roots, okay, in a taproot. So let's talk about the mechanism of flow here. We talked about mechanisms of flow in the xylem. Let's talk about mechanisms in the phloem. This is called pressure directed flow. Okay? And the way that pressure directed flow works is this. It's going to rely on osmotic pressure. So step one, the sugar source actively transports sugars into the phloem. Okay, this increases the sugar concentration. We know that if we increase the sugar concentration, that water is going to want to flow into that area in order to decrease the sugar concentration, right? This is called osmosis, right? So water flows into the phloem from the xylem. This process of water flowing into the phloem from the xylem creates an area of high pressure. High pressure is created around the source. And we know that water flows away from high pressure. Let's try to do a little diagram here. So here you got xylem. In the xylem, you've got H2O, and it's going to flow up the xylem only through root pressure and transpiration pull. Okay? Right next to the xylem, you got the phloem. Okay? At the top here, let's say here's your sugar source. Here's your sugar sink. Okay? So sugars are actively transported into the phloem from the sugar source. That increases the concentration of sugar there. This is active transport. Okay? Active transport of sugars increases the sugar concentration near the source. That causes passive transport of water into that area from the xylem, which creates an area of high pressure, which causes the water to flow away from that area. Okay? The water and the dissolved solutes. Okay? Now when we get to the sugar sink actively transports sugars out which causes the water from the phloem to go back into the xylem, which then creates an area of low pressure next to the sugar sink, which then causes water to flow towards it. Right? So this pressure-directed flow is twofold. You've got high pressure at the sugar source caused by osmosis of water coming in, and you got low pressure at the sugar sink, which is caused by osmosis of water traveling out. Right? So this is high pressure, and this is low pressure. Make sense? Anybody have any questions on pressure-directed flow or phloem? What's up?
What's the word after high pressure is
High pressure is created around the source. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about plant growth. My favorite AP exam question, I've read basically every AP biology exam from like 1991 up until now, right? And my favorite one was actually the one that I took when I was in high school. My favorite question ever. And it started out like this. I'm not even kidding. It said, little Timmy, when he's 8 years old, builds a tree fort in his backyard. Okay? And then it has a diagram. And it shows a tree like this. Yeah. Okay? And it says that little Timmy's tree fort was 10 feet off the ground and that the tree overall was 20 feet tall. Oops, 10 feet, 20 feet. Okay? There's little steps to get up to it. Okay? Then it says little Timmy grows up, he goes off to college, and when he comes back to visit his family, his tree in the backyard is now 40 feet tall. The question is, identify the height of his tree fort and explain. So, it wants to know how high the tree fort is off the ground. 20 feet?
Would it be 10 feet still? Because I mean, it's not like the trunk's the part that's stretching out, the top part's going up and doing its thing.
Yeah. So there's three answers to this, right? There's three possible answers. You either say, okay, the tree grows equally throughout, in which case it would be 20 feet off the ground because it was an increase of 20 feet, and so 10 of that would have been below it and 10 of it would have been above it, right? You could go the other way and say, okay, all the growth is at the bottom, and if all the growth is at the bottom, that means that it grew 20 feet at the bottom, so that means that the tree fort is 30 feet off the ground. But the correct answer is that the tree fort is still 10 feet off the ground because trees do not grow from their bases, they grow only from their tips. Okay? That's a great question, huh? About little Timmy? I sure did. All right, so let's talk about plant growth. So, plants it's like a stem, have some parts to them. Make these bigger so we can see them. Oops. Okay, so here's the parts of this little bud here. This is called a bud, a shoot bud. Bud. Yeah. No, one. All right. So, this thing has a lot of parts. Up here, this is called the apical meristem. Sometimes it's referred to as a terminal bud. This part here is called leaf primordia, which basically just means it's the beginnings of a leaf, right? And then down here, you've got these things that are called axillary buds that are also meristems. So these are what are called meristematic. Okay? Now, plant growth happens at meristems. Okay, so on here, there are three places where growth can occur. Growth can occur here at the apical meristem or the terminal bud. It can happen here at this axillary bud or here at this axillary bud. Okay? The other place that, that there's plant growth, right, which is called primary growth, is in the roots. And the roots have a couple different parts. Okay? Down here, you've got the root apical meristem. And then here you've got this thing that's called the root cap. And this is overall, we refer to this as a root or root tip. Okay, so if you remember back from when we did our mitosis lab, you guys looked at onion root tips, right? And one of the things you should have noticed about your onion root tip is there was a lot of mitosis that was happening at the very end of it, the very tip of it. But if you looked up near the base of your slide, you would have seen not a lot of mitosis happening. And the reason for that is that mitosis only occurs where there's growth happening, and that means that it's only going to occur at the meristem, which is at the very end, the apical meristem. Okay. The root cap would have been all the dead cells that were around the dividing cells, and those are there to protect it, right? If you imagine what a root is actually doing, a root is forcing its way through the soil, right? If you think about like the soil in Florida here, it's sand, so that would be essentially like running your hand along sandpaper as you're trying to force your way through that soil, and so it would destroy the apical meristem if it didn't have protection, but the root cap provides it with protection, okay? All of this meristematic growth here is called primary growth, right? So there's two types of growth. First type is called primary growth. Okay, and primary growth is a type of growth that all plants have. All plants have primary growth. That occurs at meristems. Okay. Sometimes called meristematic growth because it's happening at the meristems. Okay, so plants grow taller. As plants grow taller, that is the result of their apical terminal meristems plants grow deeper. That is the result of their root meristems. And plants grow bushier. That is the result of axillary buds. When you learn about physiology, axillary has a couple of meanings, but when you learn about physiology of humans, a lot of the things that we refer to as axillary are things that are in your armpits, right? And I think that's kind of funny when you look at the shoot bud, because if you think about like the apical meristem as head and its leaf primordia as his arms, then the axillary buds are like in the armpits, right? Right here. Anyways, all right. Then you also got secondary growth. And not all plants undergo secondary growth. Only woody plants undergo secondary growth. And the growth happens at areas that are referred to as cambiums. So this causes plants to grow thicker. And there's two major types of cambiums that we're going to look at. There's something called the vascular cambium, and there's something that's called the cork cambium. Okay, so let's look at how cambiums function. So we're going to start out with a thick area here. Where's my little pen thickness tool? So that's going to represent the vascular cambium. Okay. On the outside of the vascular cambium, the phloem grows. On the inside of the vascular cambium, the xylem grows. Okay, so we can say that out here, we've got phloem, and phloem grows really slowly, and it remains active, right? It's the cells are alive and they're active. Okay, on the inside, you've got xylem. Xylem grows pretty quickly, and we know that they're dead at maturity. And there's actually a length of time that they are usable before they start to sort of rot away. Okay, this is all xylem. So you can see that the outside of the vascular cambium would produce phloem, the inside of the vascular cambium would produce xylem. Okay, the xylem is what we refer to when we say that, like if I was going to go to Home Depot and I was going to go buy wood to build something, I would be going to buy xylem, right? Because all the other stuff would have to be cut away. It's not useful. In a plant, right, in a tree or something like that, only the outside layers here, the layers that are closest to the cambium, those are the newest layers. Those are the ones that are going to be active within the plant. Okay, the ones that are on the inside are inactive and they're going to be dry. They're not going to actually function anymore. What's up?
So those are like you know, like when you cut. So those are like the rings of like.
Those are the rings. Yeah. So that's my next point here. The rings indicate what? Age, right? How do we know the age from the rings? So eat 1 ring per year? 10 rings per year?
Wait, no, it's the distance between each one. Because there's like thick ones and there's like really thin.
Yeah, so what you'll see is you will see dark rings and light rings, right? And the dark rings represent slow growth that you would have in the wintertime, and the light rings represent fast growth that you would have in the summertime. So every 2 rings would represent 1 full year, would mean 1 slow season, 1 fast season. Except if you're in a tropical climate like Florida, where occasionally we have no wintertime, and so it's possible in Florida to have a giant light ring that would indicate that there was no slow growing season that year. And so it would be impossible to tell the true age of a tree in a tropical climate because they pretty much grow all year long, right? Normally though, you'd have dark ring, light ring, dark ring, light ring, light ring. Now sometimes you'd have, you know, a really, really light ring, which would indicate really high temperatures and a lot of rainfall and stuff like that. And sometimes you have a light ring that's, you know, a little bit smaller, and that would indicate less rainfall. And so we can use trees in order to determine historic rainfalls by looking at the size of the rings, because we can determine the conditions around them based on the size of those rings, right? Because theoretically, if the conditions were good, then the growth ring should be large, right? Okay. There's another cambium outside of this that we're not going to talk about as much right now, but it produces something that's called cork. And when we combine cork with phloem, it's what we call bark. So the bark of a tree is cork plus phloem. So interestingly enough, you guys ever seen maple trees? You know, uh, like you get maple syrup from maple trees, right? That's where it comes from. And anybody know how they actually get the maple syrup or the maple sap out?
Hammer in that tool.
Yeah, they hammer in a little like spike that has like a little faucet on it, essentially, right? And you got to be good at it because if you hammer it in too far or you pick a maple tree that's too young, right, you will hammer right through the vascular cambium and you'll go into the xylem. And then the stuff that comes out is xylem sap. And xylem sap is just water, right? It's water and minerals from the ground. And so that's not going to make very good maple syrup. You want to hammer it in just enough that you get into the phloem, because the phloem at this point, when you're harvesting it, is taking sugars from the leaves and it's transporting them down to the roots, right, to get ready for the wintertime. And so as those sugars are coming down towards the roots, you're able to harvest that phloem sap, right, which has all the sugars and the secondary compounds that taste like maple syrup. Now, it doesn't taste immediately like maple syrup. It tastes like maple water when you first get it, and then you got to like boil it, and when you boil it, the water goes away, and then it becomes syrupy. But that comes from the phloem, right? And if you went past that phloem, if you went past that point, you would go to the xylem, and you'd get a completely different thing. What's up?
Could you get a water source from this one?
Yeah, yep. That's actually a thing that you can take a very similar tool and punch it into the center of the tree, right? And it doesn't like pour out or anything, but it can be a stable, reliable water source where the tree will pull water out of the soil and then it'll drip down into your little spigot.
Does that hurt you at all, taking the water and sap?
I mean, driving a spike into it is probably worse for it than taking the sap. All right, so let's talk about primary growth and something that's called apical dominance. Apical dominance is based on the hormone auxin. Auxin is a plant hormone that when it's in high quantities, it inhibits growth, and when it's in low to medium quantities, it stimulates growth. Stimulates growth in low to medium quantities. So, auxin is produced by the terminal buds. So, if we had a stem, here's our terminal bud. Okay, here's our leaf. Let's put one closer. Leaf primordia, axillary buds, leaf primordia, axillary buds. Okay, so the auxin's produced up here, and it travels what we call downstream, right? And as it travels downstream, it becomes more and more diluted. Like that. Okay, there's a gradient of auxin concentration. Something like this. Okay, so here you can see there's high concentration of auxin. Here There's a medium concentration of auxin. And so the result of this is that where the concentration of auxin is high, this inhibits growth. So it stops these two axillary buds here from sprouting, right? But here, it's going to stimulate growth. So it will cause these two axillary buds to sprout, okay? And now each of these axillary buds will become a terminal bud, right, for their own little stem that's coming out of there, right? What's the advantage of this?
You can use like phototropism, where depending on what auxin is, it can grow in a certain direction.
So your tropisms are controlled by auxin, but like, why specifically do we want to inhibit the sprouting of these terminal buds here? Think about the structure of a plant. If we start branching at the exact end of a stem, then it's going, or of a what am I? Yeah, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like a twig, but like it's totally lost. Like my brain is gone. What? Yeah, I guess a stick. We could say a stick. Sure. So branch, yeah, but if it starts to branch here at the very tip of this branch, that's going to cause it to become too heavy because it's not thick enough yet to support that, right? And so it's going to droop down. But if it waits until this has grown far enough away, now it can branch here without weighing down the end of the branch because it's become sufficiently thick at that point to be able to support its own weight, right? So it's important that we inhibit here because the terminal bud is close, but once the terminal bud gets far enough away, then you can stimulate growth there and you can start a branch. If you are a gardener or something like that and you're trying to achieve a full-looking bush, what you do is cut off anytime you see the tip of a stem, right? Because that's going to allow it to then branch. And you allow it to branch for a little bit, and then you cut off the tips of those, and then those will branch. Because by cutting off the tip, you remove the auxin generator, which takes the apical dominance away. Yeah.
So for a palm tree, like this is how they do that, because it only grows.
No, palm trees are a different story.
Are we thinking of the word sprout?
Yes, that is what I was thinking of. Sprout. Perfect. All right. Anybody have any questions on this? All right, that is all. Yeah.
Okay, you said that when you cut it, it takes away the oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
So just like the word is oxygen.
So the auxin is generated by the actual meristem, by the apical meristem, right? And so in this case, it's going to cause it to grow slower because it's not going to have an auxin generator there, but it'll grow on its own, right? Like the default state is to grow a little bit, but auxin just makes it grow faster when it's in medium concentration. Yes. In this case, for apical dominance. For some of the tropisms, there's other places that auxin comes from, like the dark side or whatever.